Hi, I'm Kat Parnell, and along with Max Frazier, we run Birchbark Editing and Microlit Almanac. And I would like to welcome all of you to our July In Conversation event with Joy Ladin and David Orr, and they will be discussing many wonderful things. I'm very excited about it. Before I get started, I want to make a few announcements. The most important one is please mute your mics if you're not already muted. That way there won't be any ambient sound distorting this particular, I don't know, what do we call it? A Zoom broadcast. So I'd like to highlight a few events and publications with Birchbark Editing. We have these mix and meet sessions where people meet once a month. The next one is Tuesday, August 9th, and that's if you are in need of inspiration. We provide writing prompts. It's always a great time. Our online publication, Microlit Almanac, we recently published a really kind of cool story by Erica Fluf-Lazur. It's called The Games We Played, and if you're looking to trip back in time, take a look. We'll be opening submissions in September, and in later this week, we will be publishing something in Ukraine bulletins about the war in Ukraine and the connection between that and rock and roll. We'll be offering classes in September as well. So we welcome all of you to spread the word or to join us for those classes. And as always, we do this out of the goodness of our hearts, and our hearts are pretty big. And so please consider donating. We appreciate it. Now, the main event. I'm going to introduce Joy Ladin and David Orr. Joy Ladin has long worked at the tangled intersection of literature, Judaism, and transgender identity. She has published 10 books of poetry, including her new collection, Shekhinah Speaks, and apologize for my pronunciation. The National Book Award winner, The Book of Anna, The Future is Trying to Tell Us Something, and Transmigration and Impersonation. She is also the author of a memoir of gender transition, National Jewish Book Award finalist, Through the Door of Life, and another work of creative nonfiction, Lambda Literary and Triangle Award finalist, The Soul of the Stranger. Her work has been recognized with a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, a Fulbright Scholarship, an American Council of Learned Societies Research Fellowship, and a Hadassah Brandeis Institute Research Fellowship, among other honors. You're getting the picture, I think. She's been featured on Krista Tippett's On Being, and she has an online conversation series called Containing Multitudes. We're very pleased to have you join us, Joy. Speaking with Joy tonight is a visual artist and poet, David Orr, whose photo is the foundation for the book cover. I don't know if you can see that. There you go. And David is based in California. His work has been shown extensively in the United States and internationally. In shows juried by representatives from the De Young Museum, the International Center for Photography, the Lucy Awards, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the New Museum of Contemporary Art, the New York Times, and the Whitney, among others. His work is in public collections among such artists as Ansel Adams, Jim Dine, David Hockney, the Brothers Kay, Edward Weston, and Joel Peter Witkin. David's most recent solo exhibition, Radiance and Reflection, was on view at Tibet House US in New York City and closed on Sunday. So with those very extensive introductions and bios, which are pretty amazing, we'll begin with Joy reading from her poetry, followed by David talking about some of his images before they share a conversation about the intersection of written and visual expression. Joy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kat, and I want to thank Birchbark for hosting this. About 5 minutes into my first conversation with David, I was already dreaming of doing a public conversation with David, and I'm really grateful to you for making it a reality. So I'm going to read a few poems from Shekhinah Speaks, These poems are all spoken in the voice of the Shekhinah, which is the name in Jewish mystical tradition for the female aspect of God, the immanent rather than transcendent aspect of God, the aspect of God that is with each one of us at every moment in our lives and actually experiences and feels and has to go through everything that each human being has to go through. In Jewish tradition, the Shekhinah doesn't speak. She's silent. It's a product of the gender binary, right? So if you have a male aspect of God that talks and does things and is transcendent, then the female aspect of God has to be the subordinate opposite of that. But I really wanted to know what the Shekhinah would say and how she would say it, and that's the impetus behind this project. And as that unfolded, it turned out that the Shekhinah is constantly speaking to each of us directly. In all of these poems, she's speaking to a singular you, but because she sees each of us from the inside out, she feels that that one singular you is enough to personally, individually designate each of us. That from the inside, we look basically similar to her, and even though she knows us as individuals. So ideally, you should hear these poems as speaking to you. That's her goal. So the first poem I'm going to read is called Ready, and each poem is made out of words found in two different kinds of text. First kind of text is a chapter of Isaiah, in this case, a chapter that includes the words, "Fear not, I am the one who helps you." And the other text is an article from Cosmopolitan magazine that in some way resonates with the Isaiah text. And this Cosmo text is 7 Empowering Life Lessons from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And I highly recommend it. They're really good life lessons. Ready. Are you ready to be strong? Are you ready to follow me beyond the fear that warns you to hold your tongue when cruelty and hopelessness, degradation and evil stab you through the heart? Fear likes you this way, self-loathing and numb, believing you're no one I'd ever choose, a worm in a tunnel, dust in a gale, a nameless pool of blood I could never love. I summon them all to judgment, the fears that stalk you to the ends of the earth, the shame and disgrace that nail you in your place, everything that gets in the way of you responding when I say, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I was here before fear, and I'm there beyond it, opening fountains, trampling kings underfoot, calling you to me across generations, by paths you haven't walked, by ways you cannot imagine. I'm the mother who really sees, the father who understands you, every version, real and imagined, future and past, cypress and desert, queer fluid light, thresher of mountains, solitary pine. You have nothing to fear and nothing to prove. Are you ready to be strong? Time to remake the world. So when I was starting this project, and that covers a long period of time when I was starting this project, my first question was, how does the Shekhinah speak? And my first answer to that was, any way she wants to. But I think you can hear that even in this poem, that she puts words together that don't necessarily go together. She speaks with an absolute confidence and sometimes almost bullying, sometimes tender, sometimes both at once somehow. And she is determined not only to tell us who she is, but also to tell us who we are. And in this poem, which comes at the beginning of the book, Stillborn, she is trying to help us, the human you, recognize her, because she knows that we're not aware of her. So she's trying to help us along by prompting us. You're still being born, still trying to understand what you are and where I am, inside or outside, attached or disattached. Still digging, still scraping, still filling with time, still buried, still growing, still waiting to be delivered. I know. I'm the neighbor who's always watching, the teacher who's sometimes kind, the mother who sees how hungry you are, the doctor who makes you sick. Sometimes I stagger you with terror, but I also cover your body with flowers, pinks and sweetheart roses. When they wilt, I remain, before you're born, and there in the casket, you are still my favorite color, a cloud I continue to ride, even when you're no longer moving, a love into which I keep falling, even when you're no one, nothing, stillborn or miscarried. I still surround you like a uterus, and you are still my baby. So at this point in the Shekhinah exists outside of time. So for her, these poems are all being spoken simultaneously. There isn't like a before and after, but human beings, at least me, we don't work that way, and language doesn't work that way. So there had to be a sequence. And this next poem, you'll see, reflects an aspect of her relationship where she knows that she's not being heard. She's speaking because she has to, but she knows we're not hearing her. This is called Melting Away. And the text from Isaiah includes the quote, "You say to yourself, I am, and there is no one besides me." And the Cosmo article is, "The scary, scary way your friends are losing weight." Melting away. I sit in the stubble of your heart, listening to you say, I am. I am, you say, and there is no one besides me, by which you mean no one to remember, no one to love your wise and childish, tender, obsessive, intermittent selves, melting together, melting away. I am, I say, but you don't hear me. On good days, you wish I were there. On better days, you crave me. On the best days, you feel me sitting amidst the brokenness of your body, your strange shiny pleasures and cardiac butterflies, lifting the veil of your darkness, setting your dust on fire. I am, I say, and there is no one besides me. And for a moment you know it's you I'm calling, that I am the love into which you're falling, evaporating, one I am at a time. The part of you, the only part, that isn't melting away. And the last poem I'm going to read now is called Shame. It's part of a different section. Shekhinah now knows that this is a moment in the relationship where she knows the you is listening. And so there's a lot less wistfulness and a lot more demandingness from her. Like, you know, having a relationship with the Shekhinah comes with responsibilities. Literally, once we hear her, we have the ability to respond to her. And once we have the ability to respond, she sees us as having the responsibility to respond. The Isaiah quote is wonderful, actually. God says, "Woe to the one who says to a father, 'What have you begotten?' or to a mother, 'What have you brought to birth?'" And the Cosmo article is called, "I had an abortion in Alabama, and my neighbors shamed me." Ashamed of what you are and aren't, you struggle to stay connected, part of the family, part of the culture that sometimes makes you feel like a monster, telling yourself you're the opposite of brave, that whatever you are is the opposite of what I meant to make. How dare you question what I create? Your shame and your panic, your sex and your rage, where you're broken and where you break, I bore them, I bear them, I open the gates of privilege and stigma, so even you can see the image, my image, in which you were made. You can hide from everyone, child, but you can't hide from me. I'm your calamity and your queen, the truth from which there's no protection, the heaven that stretches equally over victory and shame. I foretold you long ago, declared to the ends of the earth, I would be your potter, and you would be my clay. A storehouse I'd fill with treasure, a habitation for my name, matter fashioned into revelation, a cloud from which I reign. Thank you.
Well, that's a tough act to follow. I'm going to show you a number of images, including the series from which Joy chose the image for the cover for this book. The fascinating thing that happened when she and I spoke, and the reason that we wanted to do this together, is I was contacted by a publisher who said, "Oh, we have a poetry collection. We would love to use your image in the cover." And I said, "Great. I'd love to meet the poet and talk to them a little bit about and I'd like to see the manuscript, and I'd like to talk to them a little bit about the project." And we had one of those rare meetings where we were kind of finishing each other's sentences. And you'll kind of see that as I'm going to go through these images very quickly to kind of give you an overview of what I work on. But you will see very quickly there's a lot of overlap in just the idea and the thinking that we're doing, the ideas and thinking. So my name's David Orr. You knew that. The first series that I started working on as an artist that really began to cohere was a series called LIBRI. And it was about books. And my thinking was books can take you places. So I wanted to make places out of books. And so The Prophet was one of the first ones that I did. And it's interesting because Shekhinah also talks about shelter. And so there's an element of that. And The Prophet is a text that actually is hugely popular in prisons because people take great comfort from it. And they see it as a kind of shelter. And so I created this image to feel as if it was a kind of shelter. This book was given to me when I was a child, and I had read it a number of times over the years, and each time I revisit it, it feels different. And so I wanted to try a different feeling too, where perhaps there was a feeling of light or creation in the distance. And so this is the image that I came up with to represent that. And this is the image that Joy found and chose for this collection. And as you can see, among other things, it's quite yonic. And that makes a lot of sense for this collection. So I felt like it functioned on a number of levels that were already swimming around in the background when Joy and I were speaking. I'm just going to show you a couple other images very quickly. This is an image of Beowulf that I wanted to feel like a coat of arms. You can see it behind Maxie Jane as well. And the idea was, this is the Seamus Heaney translation, where one side is the Gaelic and the other side is the translation, and I wanted you to see both. So I projected and reflected so you could see both texts at the same time at certain parts of the image. This is an image of the short story Cathedral by Raymond Carver, wherein a man is describing to a blind man what a cathedral is, and ultimately decides to draw it himself and closes his eyes and enters a kind of transcendent state. And I was thinking about the blind man really being an auditory experience primarily in terms of his input, but then this beautiful shape that may or may not have anything to do with the cathedral in his mind. And this is the image that I came up with. I did a series called Perfect Vessels. These are images of skulls. The vessels, I was thinking of the Old Testament and clay, and it's funny that the last poem that Joy just read mentions clay, because it was something that kept running around in my head. And I'm a little bit obsessed with symmetry, because symmetry makes anything perfect. And I photographed a series of skulls at the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. It's a pathology museum, so many are misshapen, but by repeating the mistakes, I'm making something perfect in terms of its form. And most vessels themselves are perfectly symmetrical. And I wanted you to think of it as a container, as an origin point, also as a mandala. And so some of these, the four that I'm going to show you here were up at the Tibet House show, and Bob Thurman especially really loved these. And you can see areas that are pretty auspicious become emphasized, like on the top of the crown of the head. In Hindu tradition, there's the aperture of Brahman, that's where the soul emerges. It's a portal. And so the mirroring actually emphasized that. I like this one because at the Mutter, there's a interesting phenomenon of that collection is they actually had the histories of who these people were. A lot of these things end up being black market, and there's sordid stories that you'll never know, but you also never know who the people were. Many of these were documented. And in this case, this guy, Giza Armeni, the information about him included the phrase that attempted suicide at 70, lived till 80 without further melancholy. And I think there's something to be learned from that. I also love the fact that, of course, he's got a big grin. This is an image that has scarring due to syphilis, but if you look at the forehead, there's almost a kind of scarab image that appears there because of the mirroring, and it becomes more pronounced when you see it up close. The ILLUMINED series, after I finished LIBRI, I'd done a number of other series, and I really wanted to return to books, but I wasn't exactly sure which area I was going to enter. And I had been studying quite a bit of Buddhism, and I was really interested in seeing what a sutra looked like in real life. And I found an institution in Los Angeles called the Philosophical Research Society that actually was assembled by an autodidact named Manly Hall, who collected texts from all wisdom traditions. And so you could go to one place and see an actual Quran or an actual Rosicrucian text or a Judaic text. And that became the key to the next series, because I became very interested in, first of all, learning about these traditions and also learning about where they might overlap and where similar thinking occurred. And I'm particularly interested, and the reason I was interested in Buddhism is I'm very interested in the area where philosophy, science, and art overlap, because I do believe that that's where truth may lay. If you're able to look at the same problem through many different lenses and you're arriving at the same destination, that's a pretty good indicator. So in this instance, I was making images that were mandala-like and meditative out of text. And so I was blurring away the fixed language and trying to create something that you could react to and hopefully transport through into a different kind of understanding. And I was making the point that all religions are attempting to create something that both lives in you and that you can also transcend. And I wanted to create forms that emphasize that these different approaches are different avenues, perhaps, to a single truth that we need. There's an interesting era of history called the Axial Age, where most of the great religions emerged at the same time. And it's almost as if it was a step in our evolution that we needed this feeling of not being alone or a transcendent spiritual force. This is a collection of Sinhalese texts from Ananda Kumsumari. Obviously, it's a spark of thought in the dark. I'm wanting to create something that feels like a beacon, and hopefully all of these draw you in. This is an interesting one. It was a play written about the architect of the Tower of Babel by Eliphas Levi, who was a noted occultist. He had actually he was in a seminary and fell in love and left, and then became interested in magic. But I think of language as a construction, and I think the Tower of Babel myth lends itself to that. Just for those of you who might be rusty, I'm sure this is a very literate group, and I'm going to embarrass us all by recapping. But the idea of the Tower of Babel was that they were going to create that everyone could speak a language and communicate with each other, and they attempted to build a tower that would reach heaven. And he actually made such progress that God was alarmed and destroyed it. and also destroyed the ability for different cultures to communicate with one another. It's an origin myth about why we all speak different languages. So it wasn't a huge leap to create an idea that, think of language as a construction and create a construction from it. This is the Prajnaparamitra Sutra. It's actually a collection of sutras, but one of the features of this, if you haven't seen a sutra in real life, it's a rectangular form that has the pages interspersed in between. And the idea is that it has a rectangular wooden cover and bottom, and the pages are in the midst. The idea was you could wrap a rope around it, tie it to your horse, and ride to the next village with it, and then unfurl it. It would be protected. Really special texts also got some extra protection in that they would layer silk from robes of monks. And that's what this particular text had, and that's why there's these bright colors. This is a Hindu manuscript, which is Brahma dreaming of Vishnu creating the universe. And the idea is that if Brahma stops dreaming, Vishnu will stop creating, and the universe will end. So it's a really fascinating feedback loop. And also in Eastern traditions, there's the double Vajra, which is the double lightning bolt. And that's the shape that I was mimicking here to give it that feeling. I'm going to skip ahead here. I did a project where every Friday I would send out flowers to different people on a list to sort of cheer them up. It was during the pandemic. I was miserable. I had seen Andrea Bocelli do that live simulcast from the cathedral in Milan, and I thought, what can I do to send a little light out? And so every week I would send out a flower to people on a list. And eventually I for the show at Tibet House, I created a video where it's a moving mandala, and the after image of all the flowers whizzing by is the actual mandala. And lastly, Mandala LUNAE. So I stopped sending out the flowers because it was up to a year, and I thought, okay, a year's a good stopping point, and plus the pandemic was over, right? And 6 months later, it wasn't. And in the interim, I'd been gifted a telescope, and my mother worked for Questar telescopes for a while when I was a kid. One of my fondest memories was sitting on a hill with her with this thing looking at the heavens, and it really kind of shaped something about the way I look at things. And so I started taking photographs of the moon and creating mandalas. And in this instance, I started sending them out on Mondays, which is the day named after the moon. And if you're curious, you can navigate to my site, and there's a place where you can sign up to be included on this list. I just sent out number 46 on Monday. So we're getting close to a year, and I may stop it there, but the way that things are going, I'll probably have to cook up something else to send out every week, because it doesn't seem like the dark days are stopping. This one actually was interesting. The Dalai Lama's birthday was that week, his 87th. And so I went out the night of his birthday and photographed this moon and created this image. So it's a little bit of a birthday card. And there you go. I hope that didn't take too long. Thank you so much.
You could keep going all night as far as I'm concerned. That's fabulous.
So, Joy, one of the things I wanted to talk about actually is building meaning. Because I'm really interested in do we uncover meaning, or are we creating it? Have we uncovered something that's already there? Are we applying our own logic to it? And also, there's a very unique way for me that poetry creates meaning, because the language is just one part of it. It's the way that the words collide that create the meaning. And I feel it very strongly in your work. And I also thought it was really interesting also that you have a couple collisions going on in a weird way, in that you've got the text from Isaiah and Cosmopolitan Magazine, and you're interspersing them, and then the words are rubbing against each other, and there's all sorts of dynamics occurring here. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I want to start though by I'd not heard that about Brahma dreaming of Vishnu creating, but your question seems like that kind of a question. The question about how does meaning work? How does it emerge? Is meaning a recognition of something that's already there? Is it something that we create, which only exists in retrospect? Is it the wake of a boat that's moving across the water? Is it the water? You know, is it the boat, the thing that's holding us up? There are a lot of different ways of conceiving it, and with language, it's particularly complicated because, um, in a way, you know, I don't create meanings. I'm just manipulating words that are already part of a dynamic system of meaning. Some of those meanings are denotative, like they're pointers to other things. Some of them are layers of resonances and historical and etymological. There's all kinds of stuff, but it is certainly not me doing it. And that would be, I think, a basic crossover between the kind of art that you were doing with the books, where you're creating these beautiful images out of texts that are systems of meaning, you know, that are created out of this, and you're creating another kind of order, another kind of meaning out of the physicality of those texts. In a certain way, that's what poets are doing with language, with words, and the systems of meaning that they're drawn from. But the in the case of, you know, one of the formal problems of that I think each poem has to solve is this question of how is meaning going to be presented or enacted. You know, there are some texts. I'm for better or worse, I've just accepted this. I think that there is really great poetry, fantastic poetry, that is not meaning based. It uses language in ways that short circuit meanings. Like, I'm a big Emily Dickinson fan, Cesar Vallejo. They use systems of meaning, tie them in knots, and use them to launch us beyond them. And I think, you know, I stand in awe of those things, but I unfortunately I can't seem to do that. You know, I can admire it, but I can't do it. For me, an actual thread of meaning is an essential part of my work and my work process. Um, it requires me, you know, I need things to mean something to tell if I'm being honest. I need things to mean something to see if something larger is happening. Really, I feel that these are limitations. But as you know, art is made out of our limitations. You know, it's not just made out of the strengths that we have. It's also made out of what's hard for us. So in the Shekhinah poems, one of the hard things that, you know, the Shekhinah really collided with my immeasurable limitations as a poet. You know, your limitations really stand out when you're trying to help divinity speak. And one of the basic limitations is not my fault, which is this sequentiality. So one of the many wonderful things about your work is what you do with the simultaneity of visual images. And one of the reasons I love the Lunar series so much is because they're both simultaneous and sequential and dynamic. You have all of this motion in them, and yet it's all happening at once. And, you know, that's really what the Shekhinah wanted me to do, and I never figured out how to do it. So instead, we had to settle for creating sentences which would simultaneously mean at the level of each line. Most of them are long and heavily enjambed. So each line has to mean something. And then the next line, two lines together need to mean something different, and a three-line sequence needs to mean something, and whatever it is, until you get to the sentence. And then the sentence is saying all of those things at once. The Shekhinah really loves the periods at the end of sentences, because those are the instructions that finally, from her perspective, finally give the instruction to the human brain to see all of these words and signifiers as meaning at the same time, so that the meaning is everything all at once. That's really what she wants us to get to. But for me, often the meaning was the intimacy of the unfolding and the shifting of language. And I loved the way that she would felt like she was coming at me from multiple directions at once. And then when we get to the end of the sentence, I'm like, well, I can't process all of that. I'm holding on to a horse that, a bucking bronco or something. And now you want me to remember all of those motions simultaneously and realize that they together mean something else. You're going to have to find yourself another poet if that's what you want. But that is the way I think she's conceiving of meaning. For me, it was more, the meaning was this journey that gave me a feeling of intimacy with somebody who knew me inside out and was in a way turning me inside out, in the hopes that when I was turned inside out, I would realize that the inside of me was actually her.
There's so many beautiful ideas in what you just said, and I was so busy listening, I'm not going to be able to unpack it all. But one of the things that I really loved was all this happening simultaneously. It's an interesting. Anybody who's creative knows that they didn't really make the work; they kind of found it. And songwriters and poets especially, but myself too. There's something that happens. I'm not sure what it is, and I'm picking up some sort of signal. And and I feel that in a way, what you described with Shekhinah is beautiful, because it can be that. It's one day you can find one thing, and another day you find another. And so I remember I was rereading the introduction to the book just before we jumped on, and you talk about having to be sequential, because that's how we think and how we work, and that and now you're talking about it all being at once. But in a way, you kind of get to have your cake and eat it too, because you pull down the ideas and then you put them in an order. So I don't know. I feel like that clicks. That
is the aspiration.
Yes, of course. I also there's something actually I heard you talk about in an interview. Actually, I think it was the On Being, but you were talking about. Just find this quote here. You were talking about teaching at an Orthodox school and feeling that the students had this very specific relationship to the divine that I thought was just remarkable. Just gonna grab this real quick, because you talked about there's some misogyny in there, but there was also, they seem much more connected to a purpose in life, I think is the best way of putting it. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yes. One of the things that makes non-Orthodox Jews glad that we're not Orthodox Jews is that we don't conceive of God as being invested in in us following all of these laws and rules and customs, right? It's like that feels stifling and oppressive and claustrophobic and rote. It doesn't feel like a spiritual practice. But with my students, when I saw them living this, I realized, oh, actually, I mean, it can be that also. I mean, I'm sure that there's zillions of ways to be an Orthodox Jew, and I'm sure being bored is a big part of it as well. But what they seem to also have is a sense that their lives really mattered. because this is you know, we say the devil is in the details, but for them, God is in the details. The way you demonstrate your awareness that your life only takes place in relation to that which is beyond you is by following these things. Why are you doing them? Well, it's not because you feel like it. It's not because, you know, nothing good is on Netflix, so you think you'll light Shabbat candles now. It's because in some way that you don't have to understand, it absolutely matters. If you light the candles too late, the universe has been broken a little bit. And that means that even in this misogynist culture, which it is, it's a patriarchal tradition, and there's a lot of different ways that that works out. But women have their own commandments, and those commandments mean that that you know, God is needing you to do these things, which means that your life has meaning, which is very different from growing up and living in a secular world, like an American world, often very atomized, that says, actually, your life has no meaning. If you want your life to have meaning, you have to, quote unquote, give it meaning. You know, your life is a failure if you fail, it's a success if you succeed. If you're not happy, something is terribly wrong with your existence. And, you know, none of us are enough to be guarantors of our own meaning at all times. And I saw in my students, I expected to see them bowed by this patriarchal tradition, but instead I saw them really have an upright quality, because I think that they were taught that what they do really matters in ways that go far beyond them.
Yeah, I loved that. And I after I got over my shock about you talking about Orthodox, you know, you know, in this context, I really was struck by that. And it ties into something else actually that you talk about, which is, and it's in your work, and it's also in another section of the On Being interview, where you say, I think all human beings actually are ratios of being and becoming. And of course, ratio being becoming, I immediately see that, you know, as, you know, in my mind. But there's also the idea that we're sort of continuing to be born in a way.
Yes.
And I found that in the language of your book, you know, it's all over the place, and I love that idea. I'm not sure there's a question there.
Well, I'd like to say, I mean, number one, I was so pleased with that phrase and the idea of ratios, um, and, but really what it was when a trans person is in transition, which is to say, this is not the case for all trans people who identify as trans, but, you know, in my case, I'd spent my life not being who I was. And then there was this incredibly compressed burst of becoming at an age when you're like already supposed to be who you are. But I was unfolding, and there's a great vulnerability and awkwardness. It's very awkward to become, it's messy, you know, it's like junior high school in your 40s. Bad time to repeat junior high school. So one of the questions that I had is, I feel so different, partly because of the trans stuff, but partly just because I know I need to become, you know, and that made me feel like I'm at such a disadvantage among all of these grown-up people who already are themselves. And then it took me a long time to realize, no, actually, I don't know anybody who's not also becoming simultaneously. But it is the different proportion. Was not at all true that everything in my life was in a state of change and becoming. A lot of things were, but many things weren't. Later, I would discover what had stayed the same throughout. When I was in the midst of it, I couldn't tell. But my most settled friends who seemed to know each of themselves they were also growing and changing and being forced to change. I mean, that is the nature of humanity. And so I started to see this idea of being, which, a lot of trans claims to identity. You say, well, I really am this, this, I really am, what you're seeing is the real me. This is my essence. Um, and I was starting to realize that, that is a shaky claim for anybody. That, we don't, being, you can't be a full human being and just be your essence. You also have to be dynamic. But I want to say, like, way better than the phrase ratios of being and becoming is just like looking at those moon images. I mean, that's it. You're taking images of the being of the moon, right? This is just each of those circles is a unit of being, a unit of essence. And you are deploying it in a way that, graphically shows all of the dynamism and the becoming, the shapes within, at each of the different parts of the pictures. The moon images organize themselves into different shapes, but those shapes themselves are dynamic and unstable because they lead into and out of other shapes. I mean, you do it so much better than I was able to explain in that interview. It's just
Oh,
gorgeous.
I'm not, I don't know. Let's agree to that maybe we both got close to it, but I thank you for that. I mean, one thing that is interesting about the moons that also relates to the Shekhinah is that kind of is, we all see the moon at the same phase, but we see it at different angles. And so, so depending upon where you are, if you are out, if you're standing, if you can see the moon and you stand out at a certain time, someone in Russia is seeing the same moon at the same phase, but at a completely different angle. And so one of the things that I liked about the making a larger form out of the moon was by virtue of making spirals and geometric shapes, every angle is represented or stands a better chance of being represented. And that kind of ties into what you were saying about like this nugget of being becoming something else as well.
Yeah.
So I feel, I just want to see, where are we, Birch Bark? I don't want to.
I wanted to jump in and say, this is a fascinating conversation. And honestly, I don't want to interrupt it. I'm loath to jump in and do that. But we have a really good question here. And it's for Joy. And it's from Judy Baumel. And I'm wondering if you can speak as Joy Ladin or as Shekhinah about the title, which does not use the, and does speaks become a noun somehow? And then I have a follow-up for David, which is a craft question. How do you do all these things? You answer. I'm going to turn on the light in this room so you can see me.
That is a great question, and it relates to an earlier question, which is, I just want to clarify that the goal in this book was to take language, that words that weren't mine, literally, they're not mine. I didn't want to know what I would say if I was pretending to be the Shekhinah. Actually, I found out. I wrote some poems like that. I was inordinately pleased with them, but they left me feeling empty and also ashamed because it was a form of idolatry. I had created an image of God in my own image, very flattering to me, very not leading anybody to God and actually maybe making it harder. So the goal of the book is that it isn't me speaking. And I didn't consider the poems to be done until I was startled and afraid by what they were saying. That gave me some assurance that it wasn't me. So for some reason, I never asked myself the question that Judith asks, which is, where's the definite article? I knew that the title of the book, I'm not very good at titles, was Shekhinah Speaks. I told my wife, she said, well, that's not very interesting. And yet I knew that was going to be it. And it never occurred to me, I talk about the Shekhinah, right? What happened to that article? And I think it's not there because the book is trying to be this direct encounter with Shekhinah, with this dwellingness, this divine presence that is dwelling in us and through us and in whom we are dwelling at the same time. And that's one of the many things that I love about David's cover image, is the sense that you are entering into this. Yes, it's a candle flame, and yes, there's the human images, and there's the vaginal implication, but you can't look at that image without being drawn into the darkness, a darkness that's defined by the light. And it seemed to me that ideally, on the other side of that would be Shekhinah speaking, and the as an article creates a distance, a subject-object distance. Well, there's the Shekhinah, that's the Shekhinah, and there could be another Shekhinah, or I'm the one who's denoting this as the Shekhinah. But I think I left it off where that felt right to me because I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to arrogate that to myself. I wasn't clever enough to think of Speaks also being a noun. But I do think that if she's right and all of this communication is happening constantly simultaneously, then there's a way in which it is noun-like. It's out of time. It's dynamically happening, but it's static in a certain way. So I would say, yeah, you got more than I did there, Judith, but I think you're right.
I just want to have a quick observation. As you were saying that, I was thinking of people as vessels to help articulate the divine, and how, there's always a story of someone who comes down and says, hey, have you heard the good news? And they'll tell you, what they've heard. And in a way, by breaking this down into a linear form, you're kind of the vessel, because you're taking this myriad element that's floating around, and you're condensing it into things that we can understand. It's interesting. I don't want to make too much of that, but I think it's an interesting idea, and it's it totally. I don't know what that was. It totally adds another layer to this. I actually wanted to make sure that we address the Cosmo Isaiah, because we sort of, we're already way past that, but I wanted to back up because it's a fascinating combination. And I'm a guy. When I read Cosmo, it was the sex tips articles, those kinds of things, if I read it at all. And I remember my wife telling me, this is
what
actually...
a good husband you are.
I remember my wife telling me this isn't a silly magazine. It's, it's about empowerment, and it's about taking control. And it really, I remember from the way she spoke about it and gave me examples, I was like, okay, so, because there's the Cosmo girl, right? But there was a real there. And I learned that through that conversation. Anyway, I'm going to stop. But
okay, and I'm going to jump in there, David, because that's a fabulous question. Because so many of us think of Cosmo as this. I'm not sure how we think of it anymore, but it's always been one of those magazines that we see on the shelf at CVS or somewhere, and we like to think that we are too empowered for that, but it's actually a very empowering journal. I would have to agree with that. What is also empowering is that we respect our audience, and we close things down at 8 o'clock. So what would be great is we will open this up on Facebook. So if any of you if you're on Facebook, ask these questions, and maybe Joy can send us some information that we can include in our newsletter about the connection. between Cosmo and the Bible. That would be pretty fascinating, and it would be great. It would be great copy for a newsletter. So I want to thank everybody. Thank you so very much, David, and thank you, Joy. It was a pleasure meeting everyone and seeing everyone this evening. Stay cool and have a lovely evening, and we hope to see you again. Bye.
Thank you.
Joy, as always.
Thank you. And we just, you know, as you know, we barely began our conversation. I didn't get to talk to you about the skulls. You know, that was where Vessels was going. We've got to do a sequel.
Yes,
I would love
agree.
to. I would love it.
This fall.
Thank you to Birch Bark, too, for doing this. This is a lovely conversation. Very exciting.
Thanks so much. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.